The movie begins with a character named Cherry in 2007, a 23-year-old young man. The film opens with Cherry narrating his feelings towards the world, expressing a sense that the world is full of beauty, yet at the same time, he feels disconnected from it and unable to understand people's strange behaviors. He approaches a car that had been waiting for him and tells the driver to wait for him at the station for 2 minutes. Cherry then enters a bank wearing a mask and a hat, carrying a gun. He storms into the bank and says that he must show those around him that he is crazy and unpredictable so they will fear him. Cherry walks up to the bank teller and asks her to hand over the money she has, but he speaks to her so politely that he even asks for her name. He then reflects on how he saw a strange despair in her eyes, leading him to a flashback in 2001 where he recounts his relationship with a high school classmate named Emily. Cherry narrates how he fell in love with her at first sight and how Emily noticed this. After the lecture, she talked to him. Cherry asks her about her hometown, and it turns out she is from the same town where his ex-girlfriend lives. At that moment, Cherry pulls out a picture of his ex-girlfriend Madison, but Emily feels uncomfortable, gives a forced smile, and then leaves. Cherry reflects on Madison, how she viewed him as a weak young man and never respected him in her life. Cherry would always visit her at her dorm, and one night Madison takes him to a university party, leaving him to dance with others, which makes him feel sad. Although Madison had only been in university for a month, all the guys there already knew her. Cherry describes how he felt like he was watching his girlfriend dance in front of everyone while he stood alone. He also talks about his first job at a restaurant, but he couldn't last more than 2 weeks due to the manager's mistreatment. He mentions his close friends, Roy and Jason, noting that Jason was one of the most miserable people he had ever known, as no one listened to him or acknowledged his presence. Cherry also recounts Jason's brother, who had returned from the military suffering from PTSD. One day, Cherry attends a party thrown by his friend, where Emily was invited. At this party, under the influence of drugs, Cherry decides to confess his feelings to her. They go home together, and Emily asks him about his relationship with Madison. He responds that she was emotionally cold. The two enter a romantic relationship, and Cherry describes these moments as some of the best in his life, although Emily handled her emotions coldly and was unable to express them. Although Cherry confessed his love to her, Emily responds that she doesn't believe in love and views it as mere chemical reactions, attributing this to her father's betrayal of her mother. Suddenly, Emily decides to travel to another country to continue her university studies, which shocks Cherry and saddens him. He tries to convince her to stay, but she breaks up with him easily and asks him to handle her decision maturely. At that moment, Cherry decides to enlist in the army. Cherry visits the military recruitment officer who looks down on him due to his physical weakness. The officer asks him why he wants to join, and Cherry replies that he has seen people his age die and wants to protect the ones he loves. The officer is convinced by his words and approves his enlistment, while his friends strongly object to his decision. Jason is particularly worried that Cherry will end up like his brother, who returned from the army mentally unstable. A fight breaks out between Cherry and his friends, and suddenly Cherry receives a call from Emily telling him she's leaving for Canada the next day and wants to say goodbye. Cherry goes to meet Emily at his workplace at the bar, and when Emily arrives, she is standing with a strange guy. Cherry feels jealous and steps between them to talk to Emily, but the other guy gets angry and pushes Cherry. Cherry asks Emily to leave, and then he has to work until late. Later, a colonel at the bar talks to Cherry and asks him about his plans in life. Cherry tells him that he is enlisted in the army, which frustrates the colonel, who warns him that the army only cares about itself and that he's walking into death. The colonel asks Cherry if he could really shoot another person like himself, but Cherry cannot answer. Cherry returns home to find Emily waiting for him, and she tells him she has decided not to leave. Cherry confesses his love to her, but she has already decided to stay. However, Cherry has already applied to join the army and can't back out. Emily asks him how he could make such a decision without consulting her, and he tells her he was so sad and didn't know what to do without her. He convinces her to go to the university she wants, and he decides to go to the army, explaining that it will only take 2 years of their lives in exchange for a lifetime together. In the end, the two decide to get married. Cherry continues talking about the happy days he spent with Emily until 2003, when the first day of his military training arrives. Cherry describes his suffering in the army, where the sergeants treated him and his fellow recruits harshly, insulting them with new curses every day. During a medical exam, a sergeant discovers that Cherry is colorblind, and Cherry asks if this will affect his service in the army. The sergeant replies that as long as Cherry can see the color of blood, he can continue serving. After the medical examination, Cherry meets Jimenez, who aspires to become a medic like him. Cherry recounts that he felt their sergeant was disturbed, especially when the sergeant lost control during training and choked a trainee to death. The sergeant would tell them stories about the places they were going to, where children would carry bombs and run toward them. He admitted that in a similar situation, he had driven a tank over the children, killing them all. Cherry felt that everything happening around him was just an act, thinking the sergeant was playing the role of a sergeant with real soldiers, and the soldiers were pretending to be real soldiers. Cherry talks about the harsh and violent training, to the point that some trainees attempted suicide to escape the army. Then the medic training begins, where Cherry and Jimenez learn how to bandage wounds and temporarily treat severe injuries. Cherry proudly recalls saving 47 mannequins with Jimenez during training, still feeling that everything around him was just pretend, as if they weren't saving real people but dolls. Finally, the first day on the battlefield arrives, and when Cherry steps off the army truck for the first time, he is in complete shock. The sergeant calms him down and tells him to take a deep breath. Cherry and Jimenez are then ordered to run to the front lines to rescue 2 injured soldiers. Cherry reaches the first soldier whose intestines had exploded, and despite the shock he experiences for the first time in his life, he is forced to handle the situation normally. Cherry places the soldier's intestines back into his abdomen and covers them in a specific way before a helicopter arrives to transport the wounded. At night, Cherry returns to the camp, traumatized by what he saw. He showers with Jimenez, and they both try to scrub the blood off their bodies in an attempt to forget what they had witnessed. The next day, the army heads to the village they had taken control of, providing aid to the villagers such as first aid and food supplies. Cherry feels disgusted by one of the soldiers, who throws food on the ground for the children as if they were animals. Later, Cherry assists the injured, and an elderly man approaches him with severe wounds on his hand. Cherry is unable to determine the cause, so he asks the sergeant, who informs him that the man has an infection. When Cherry tells the sergeant that they have run out of antibiotics, the sergeant replies that the old man is better off going to die, as he doesn't care. Frustrated and angry, Cherry tries to bandage the old man's wound and asks the translator to advise him to go to a hospital. Back at the camp, Cherry notices that the infantry soldiers have gained a lot of confidence after surviving the battle, and they start to consider themselves close friends, even though they all share in the killing of people like themselves. Cherry believes that their friendship is an illusion. He and Jimenez feel depressed about what is happening, and one of their comrades asks them what they expected when they joined the army. Cherry realizes his comrade is right. There is nothing waiting for them but death. Cherry tries to seize any opportunity to contact Emily, who is very worried about him and saddened by what he is going through. One day, Cherry and Jimenez, along with the sergeant and the rest of their team, head back to the battlefield. The sergeant driving the vehicle is speeding, and Cherry advises him not to, warning that the car might get stuck in the mud. The sergeant dismisses him, telling him to stay quiet and not interfere. Moments later, the car does indeed get stuck in the mud. The sergeant tries to pull the car out using a rope tied to another vehicle, but Cherry warns him again that this might cause both vehicles to get stuck. The sergeant, angry, orders him to stay silent. Cherry's prediction comes true once again, and the team is forced to send a group to retrieve another vehicle. Jimenez rides in the vehicle with the rest of the team, while Cherry and the sergeant stay behind. Suddenly, the vehicle carrying Jimenez explodes, killing everyone inside. Cherry runs toward the burning vehicle without thinking, trying to put out the fire. There, he witnesses one of the most horrifying scenes of his life. The charred remains of his friends, who had been with him just the night before, reduced to burned skeletons. Cherry breaks down in shock, sitting in despair in front of the bodies, mourning the loss of his closest friends. That night, Cherry calls Emily in an attempt to ease his suffering, but he cannot bring himself to describe the horror of what he saw. Emily senses his deep sadness and tries to comfort him, but Cherry is overwhelmed and ends the call. After 2 years of service, Cherry's time in the army ends, and he is awarded a Medal of Honor. However, he expresses that he doesn't feel he accomplished anything deserving of the award, stating that the only thing he did was survive. After leaving the army, Cherry reunites with Emily for the first time in 2 years, but their lives have changed drastically. Cherry begins to struggle with post-army life, waking up every day to the sounds of gunfire and images of dead soldiers. His memories of the war continue to haunt him, causing severe insomnia, making it impossible for him to sleep or focus. Cherry becomes extremely irritable, losing his temper easily, even smashing household appliances when they don't work correctly. This was a significant change, as he had been a peaceful and calm person before. Over time, Cherry begins taking larger doses of sedatives to deal with his insomnia. Eventually, he quits his job and reconnects with his friend Jason, who encourages him to take drugs with him. What started as a recreational escape quickly spirals into daily addiction. Cherry returns home one day, and Emily asks him why he was 3 hours late. He responds, unaware and rude, cursing at her. This leads to a heated argument, and Emily becomes mentally exhausted, to the point where she starts taking sedatives with him. Cherry becomes nearly unconscious most of the time, trying to escape his memories of the army in any way possible. Emily also begins consuming more sedatives, eventually threatening to kill herself if Cherry doesn't stop his behavior. At that point, Cherry decides to visit a psychologist, but the doctor doesn't take his condition seriously, asking routine questions and prescribing yet another drug to help him cope with his insomnia and extreme stress. Cherry begins abusing drugs in larger quantities, and eventually, Emily gives in and decides to use drugs with him. The two fall into a life of addiction together, using every type of drug available, including the most dangerous one, heroin. They agree on specific times to exchange injections between them. Cherry is fired from his job and sinks deeper into debt. He had borrowed money from his family and friends, lying to them that he was waiting for money from the army, but in reality, he had spent all of it on drugs. With no money left, Cherry turns to Joe, the person who supplies him with drugs, and asks him for money. Joe treats him harshly and humiliates him, making him work for him like a servant. Later, Joe offers Cherry money in exchange for transporting a locked safe to someone named Black. Cherry asks what is inside the safe, but Joe refuses to tell him. Desperate for drugs, Cherry agrees, willing to do anything to feed his addiction. When Cherry returns home, Emily arrives and is overjoyed to learn that Cherry managed to buy drugs. Their lives spiral into chaos, and Cherry recounts that they were fully aware that they were slowly dying, but had come to terms with the idea of death. After taking the drugs Cherry brought home, they realize the effects aren't as strong as expected, and soon realize Joe had tricked them. Emily notices the safe that Cherry was supposed to deliver to Black, and they start to think that what they need might be inside. However, due to their impaired thinking, they don't consider the potential consequences of opening the safe. Their sole focus is on satisfying their desperate cravings, so they decide to open it. They call their friend Jason to help, but he fails to open the safe. They try various methods, like dropping the safe from a height or pulling it with a car, but nothing works. Finally, Cherry attempts to pry it open with a metal tool and succeeds. When the door opens, a large quantity of drugs falls out, and Cherry and Emily feel as if the gates of heaven have opened before them. They consume a large amount of the drugs and pass out on the floor. Suddenly, they hear loud knocking at the door and fear it might be the police. In a panic, they rush to flush all the drugs down the toilet. When they open the door, they find Joe, who knows what happened, and informs them that Black will kill them for this. Cherry tells Joe he has a plan, then heads to the bank. At the bank, Cherry hands a note to the teller that says he has a gun. The teller quickly hands him a large amount of money. Cherry rushes out of the bank, feeling elated, and hands the money to Joe. Joe leaves, but Emily feels upset because they are left with no money or drugs. Cherry pulls out some money he had hidden from Joe and continues robbing banks in the same manner. Cherry explains that he didn't understand how people could handle this situation so easily, as they showed no resistance. He spends all of the stolen money on drugs and notices that the news begins reporting about him, as bank employees had described his appearance, even though his identity was still unknown. As time passes, Emily returns home from work completely broken because she missed her scheduled heroin injection. She starts showing withdrawal symptoms such as involuntary urination and vomiting. Emily is furious with Cherry for forgetting to give her the dose on time, accusing him of doing nothing while she is the only one working. Her hands are shaking so much that she can't inject herself, forcing Cherry to give her the injection. Suddenly, Emily has trouble breathing, and Cherry rushes her to the hospital, feeling devastated. At the hospital, the doctors press Cherry to tell them what Emily took so they can save her. Her parents arrive, and they tell Cherry that they are aware of the struggles he's going through and that he is broken and hopeless. They urge him that if he truly loves Emily, he should stay away from her. Cherry decides to leave her. After some time, Emily enters a rehabilitation center to treat her addiction, but she eventually escapes and returns to Cherry. Despite this, Cherry tells her that he's not good for her and will destroy her life. Emily responds that she will remain an addict whether she's with him or not, and that she won't leave him. Her determination to stay with him is so strong that Cherry is unable to take her back to the rehab center. They fall back into their life of addiction together once again. Meanwhile, Jason needs money, so he, Cherry, and Joe plan a new heist. This time, Joe is the getaway driver with Jason, who will collect money from all the bank employees, whereas Cherry had previously only taken money from one teller. Cherry is given the gun to threaten the employees. Cherry and Jason enter the bank together for the first time. This time, Cherry changes his approach, revealing the gun and firing a shot into the air, causing Jason to panic and run away immediately. Cherry is forced to flee as well and jumps into the car with Jason and Joe. Both Cherry and Joe are furious at Jason, calling him a coward. Cherry decides to take Jason's place in the next heist, but Joe insists that he will hold the gun this time. Cherry agrees, and they enter the bank together. Suddenly, Joe fires a shot that nearly hits one of the employees, and Cherry angrily yells at him, taking the gun from him. Joe leaves the scene, abandoning Cherry, who is left to finish the job on his own and make a quick exit. He gets into the car with Jason, who is driving. They start searching the streets for Joe, fearing he might rat them out. They eventually find Joe walking alone, and they pick him up in the car. But Joe remains silent, not saying a word. Suddenly, Cherry notices a bullet wound in Joe's abdomen and can't understand how it happened. He tries to help, but realizes they need to get him to the hospital. Cherry urges Jason to drive to the hospital, but Jason refuses, afraid they'll get caught by the police if they go. Cherry insists on going to the hospital to save Joe, even though he knows it might lead to their arrest. Jason confesses that if they don't go, Joe will die. Jason cries and apologizes to Joe. Cherry is in shock, realizing that he has gone from being a medic whose mission was to save lives to a criminal watching his friend die. They leave the city, abandoning Joe's body on the ground, and drive away. The internal conflict within Cherry's mind reaches its peak after the recent events, and he is deeply affected. He then meets Black and tells him about Joe's death, who owed Black a large sum of money. Black responds by telling Cherry that he is now responsible for repaying the debt and must return all the money owed. Cherry tries to convince him that he won't rob any more banks, but Black threatens to kill his wife if he doesn't pay the debt. Cherry returns home, attempting to calm himself so he can rob again. He finds Emily asleep in bed, completely unaware, and she asks him for another dose of heroin. Cherry tells her he'll give it to her when he gets back. We return to the scene where Cherry meets Black and tells him to wait for him at the station. Cherry enters the bank and asks the teller to give him the money. Then, he removes his hat and mask, revealing his face clearly to the cameras. He places his gun on the counter and asks the teller to press the alarm. Cherry leaves the bank and hands the money over to Black. Afterward, Cherry walks to the main street and watches as police cars drive away from him. In an attempt to get their attention, he fires a shot into the air. He sits on the sidewalk and takes his final dose of drugs, savoring every sensation as if he is saying goodbye to the world. Cherry is arrested, and in 2007, he enters prison. There, he joins the prison's rehabilitation program and begins recovering from his addiction. After serving 14 years, he is granted parole and released in 2021. Cherry walks out of prison as a completely new person and is surprised to find Emily waiting for him, who has also recovered. Cherry smiles, tears filling his eyes, and together, he and Emily live a happy life forever.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.